They were dubbed the Miracle Braves, and their manager, George Tweedy Stallings, was the toast of the baseball world. Back in Augusta, he was proclaimed a hometown boy who had made very, very good. Man for man, we weren't a great team, recalled pitcher Bill James, who won 19 games and lost only one. We were an 8th-place team, and without Stallings, we would have stayed there. An Augusta native born 2 years after the Civil War, Stallings was known by several names. Reporters referred to him as Gentleman George. His players called him Big Daddy or Chief. His opponents called him the meanest man in Boston. Stallings could be a gruff manager. Once in the minors, he went out to the mound to relieve a young pitcher who'd just given up 6 straight walks. He told him not only to get out of the game, but maybe consider burning his uniform. A few moments later, smoke could be seen coming from the clubhouse, and Stallings sent someone in to get that bonehead out of there. The uniform was saved. The pitcher went elsewhere. Stallings also was ahead of his time in sports psychology, and he played the media well. According to one story, Stallings had several reporters over before the start of that 1914 World Series. He made a great show of picking up the telephone and, as they watched, calling Philadelphia manager Connie Mack to ask if the Braves could practice at his field before the game. Mack politely told Stallings that his own team would be using the field, but offered to see what he could do. Stallings exploded, and as the reporters scribbled hastily, berated his rival for the lack of respect given the Braves. The next day, headlines further angered his players, who went out and whipped the American League champs in 4 quick games. Few knew the truth, that Stallings had already made arrangements to practice at another field before his phone call.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, everybody, what's going on? My name is indeed Tim Hanlon, and I appreciate to no end you finding our little podcast here. We call it Good Seats Still Available, our curious little journey each week into what used to be in professional sports. And we love delving into teams and leagues no longer with us, including, of course, previous incarnations of such. And this week, of course, is no exception as we get into 1914 or so baseball. Yes, it's 104 years or so ago, but around this time, 104 years ago, what is now referred to as the Miracle Boston Braves. And yes, this is the team that is the early roots of today's Atlanta Braves, for you young whippersnappers out there. It's about this time in July, sort of post July 4th or so, 104 years ago, when the Boston Braves, who were literally sitting at the deep bottom of the National League at that time, had begun to indeed literally reel off dozens and dozens of wins after a relatively moribund start, and literally win the National League pennant by the end of the 1914 season by 10.5 games, literally running away over the then New York Giants, and then steamrolling their way into a World Series that the Philadelphia A's of that time, the Connie Mack-led Philadelphia A's, were the substantial favorite to win. And wouldn't you know it, the Boston Braves, a team that hadn't had a winning record in many years prior, and frankly were the number 2 team, if you will, in the city of Boston, behind the American League upstart Boston Red Sox, won that World Series in 1914 over the heavily favored Philadelphia A's 4-0, a clean sweep, the first ever in modern World Series history, a clean sweep of the World Series, and to win the Boston Braves their first ever National League championship, and frankly the last one until, I guess it was the mid-1940s, I think 1948 or so, when they actually won the National League again. A very interesting asterisk and part of the current now Atlanta Braves history. With our guest this week, Charlie Alexander, who's written, I think, the definitive book about the Miracle Braves. It's called, not surprisingly, The Miracle Braves, 1914 and 1916. It is published by our friends at McFarland, and many of you may know, maybe if you don't, you Sabre historians, of course, but for those who are not, should know that Charlie Alexander is quite a prolific, not only historian, but writer of baseball history, with some very interesting and well-documented tomes, and arguably the sort of authoritative such of folks like Rogers Hornsby and Ty Cobb and a number of other great sort of recollections and stories and biographies of some of the key players of the earliest era of professional baseball in the early 1900s. But this is a little bit of a sampling of what Charlie's work is all about, and it's our little investigation into a little chapter of the Boston Braves, this of 1916, actually 1914, right, when they won the World Series, and then the 2 years prior or following. We sort of get into it with our guest, Charlie Alexander, in a couple of seconds. Some very interesting tidbits, even again, if you're not sort of a musty old baseball, dead ball era, history fan. I think you're going to find some interesting little tidbits about the team and the city of Boston and what it eventually evolved into over the years into now today's modern day Atlanta Braves. Coming up with Charlie in just a couple of seconds. But first, I want to get a couple of promotional things out of the way. Of course, I want to remind you that Audible is the best place on the planet to get an audiobook. And there's no better way to get a trial of such by going to our little website at audibletrial.com/goodseats to get your free audiobook download. It is yours to keep. You can cancel at any time. Once you've downloaded that freebie, it is indeed yours to keep. And even if you cancel the service. And as you know by now, there's more than 180,000 titles, 180,000 titles and growing. There you go. It's more than 180,000. Let's put it that way. There is no excuse, of course, to not be able to find at least one title to burn up that free credit and get a sense of what an audiobook is all about. And it's a great way to kill time and travel and learn without necessarily having to strain your eyes. And Audible is by all means, the best way to enjoy the medium that is an audiobook. And again, audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the place to get your free 1 month subscription to the service, a free audiobook download, yours to keep. And again, a reminder that you can cancel at any time. It is no risk, really. And you'll be giving a little love to the show by trying it through that link. And we appreciate your doing so. Audiobooks are great. Give them a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the place to do it. We also want to recommend highly our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com. The promo code for that fine website, of course, is, wait for it, Good Seats. Use one word or two, doesn't matter, but that's the place where, as you search for memorabilia and items from teams long gone or oft forgotten, I'm not sure you're going to find some early 1900s baseball stuff there, but there's plenty of other stuff. Milwaukee Braves stuff for sure, as well as all kinds of other items from all kinds of other sports. Every week there's some new stuff up there, and the great photography that proprietor Dean Mitchell and friends put up there every week is just well worth the visit. And of course, once you are hooked enough to want to purchase something for yourself, by all means, please indeed use early, use often that promo code GOODSEATS at checkout, and you're going to get 15% off of all of your purchases, he says. Yes, and that's at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And we thank them, of course, for their patronage of our little showgram here. All right, let's move into the world of old-time baseball. We're going to get into the 1900s, particularly the 1914 or so version of Major League Baseball, in particular, the Boston Braves and their miracle season. And the interesting asterisk in history of this team with our guest, Charlie Alexander. And here is our conversation just about right now. I guess it would really be helpful for my audience to kind of get a sense of perhaps a little bit of your background, how you, I mean, you're obviously quite well regarded in the Sabre and other baseball historian worlds. I'm just curious, before we get going into this story, sort of your background, how you got involved in baseball history, and some of your adventures that led you to the story that we're going to be talking about, 1914 Braves.
Well, I'm a native Texan. I grew up in southeastern Texas, southeastern corner of Texas, in a little town called China, the China, believe it or not, which was 15 miles west of Beaumont. Beaumont had in the late 1940s and through the mid-1950s had a franchise in the Texas League, which is Class AA League, very strong AA League. So my parents and I saw a lot of games there in Beaumont and Texas League games, which was the closest baseball to us in that day, because the closest major league city was in St. Louis,
and
about 800 miles away.
Charlie, I'm sorry, this is circa what year, what years so?
Well, I became a baseball fan in 1946 when the Texas League started up again after it had closed down during the Second World War. So at the age of 10, and I, sort of took this from my daddy, who was a big baseball guy, I got caught up in baseball at the age of 10. And, then later on, I read it and talked about it and played it through high school, and then ended up writing about it. So, it's been a lot of fun. My connection with baseball from my childhood.
So, what kinds of things sort of got you involved in actually chronicling this? This wasn't your full-time job, was it?
No, I had no idea when I went to college and at Lamar, what's now Lamar University in Beaumont. I commuted 15 miles in there and took my BA in 3.5 years, and then went on up to Austin and took my MA and PhD in history, and was trained in what you might call the more traditional fields of history. And then my early career, I taught and I wrote about the more traditional kinds of history, American social and political and cultural intellectual history, and published several books and had a successful career. And then at a certain point, along about 1981, I was at Ohio University, but I had been at Ohio University since 1970. And I thought, well, I'll try something new. And I'd always been interested in Ty Cobb. And I was familiar with his career, again, from the time that I became a baseball fan. I'd read a lot about it. And I thought, well, there never has been a really good biography of Ty Cobb. There's a lot of, shallow stuff. So I took the biography of Ty Cobb, and Oxford University Press gave me a contract, and I wrote the book, and it was well reviewed. It turned out very, very well all around, and I got a lot of exposure out of it because it happened to be fortuitous, good timing, because about the time that the Cobb book came out in 1984, Pete Rose was creeping up on Cobb's career base hits record. So that Pete Rose gave my book a lot of publicity. There was a period of a couple of years there where every time Pete Rose's name was mentioned, Ty Cobb's name was mentioned. So that worked out quite well, and I was so pleased with the Cobb biography that I said, well, I'll look around for another significant baseball figure that would interest me. So I did the biography of John McGraw. And it was published in 1988, and then I went on and did a general history. It was published a few years later, and then I did another baseball biography of Rogers Hornsby, and then later Tris Speaker, and then, I published some other books in baseball history, most recently The Miracle Braves, and at the beginning of this year, the half-game pennant about the 1908 American League season. So I've been retired now from teaching at Ohio University since 2007, but have continued to be involved in researching and writing baseball history, and continue to be a member of SABR, maintain my SABR contacts, although I really have run out of ideas now, and I don't have a current project, so I don't know. I'm 82 years old. I think maybe I've written enough for a career.
I don't know about that. So, I mean, I need to. You're obviously sort of underselling a little bit, because you have a prodigious amount of works out there in the baseball field. I mean, you mentioned some of them, but there are if you're really interested in some of the earliest days of baseball and some of the intriguing stories, and frankly, this is partially why we kind of do this podcast. I mean, it's all started from sort of a fascination of teams and leagues that somehow, for whatever reasons, either have been previously incarnated and no longer with us, or just frankly just died, ugly or sometimes inelegant deaths along the way. And it's a sort of an interesting little sort of corner of the world, but. Your contributions, shall we say, to the world of baseball history is quite substantial. So, I urge our listeners not only to, as we get into this story about the Miracle Braves of 1914, also look into some of the deeper works that Charlie has written. These Rogers Hornsby and Ty Cobb biographies in particular are quite substantial and quite foundational, I guess, to the overall understanding of some of the earlier generations of baseball stars.
Yeah, you talk about teams that have gone. Of course, John McGraw's Giants are long gone from New York, and the old Boston Braves are long gone to Milwaukee and then to Atlanta. But the so-called dead ball era, I have some qualms about that term. But anyhow, the early 20th century, I find fascinating in a lot of ways, and that's, for the most part, that's the period that I've written baseball history in.
Why that era in particular, and what in particular is your issue with this sort of dead ball term? We've had a couple of episodes that have touched on various aspects of that quote unquote dead ball era, but I'm curious as to why that era is interesting to you generally, and then what the terminology issues you might have with sort of how that those, I guess, 2 decades or so in the early part of the century were defined or have been defined.
Well, for one thing, as far as that period is concerned, you have a lot of colorful characters, Cobb and McGraw, and the Chicago Cubs of Tinkerty, Everest Chance, and so on and so on. A lot of colorful teams. And it was a much smaller universe in those days. The relations between owners were much more personal and intimate, and oftentimes very acrimonious, as opposed to today. Basically, baseball today is corporate business, and it's hard to name who owns which team, anymore. In fact, the NFL owners are more visible than the baseball owners. Jerry Reinsdorf of the White Sox have been a few exceptions, but things were a lot smaller. They were a lot more personal, and consequently, in writing about going back in the 1890s and then on up through the early decades of the 20th century, you're writing about a time when people in baseball knew each other and oftentimes didn't like each other. So that a lot of that is what gives character and interest to it. As far as the term dead ball era is concerned, my quarrel with that is simply that nothing happened to the baseball after 1900. It was the same baseball that had been in place since baseball began to be mass-produced in the Spalding factories back in the mid-1870s. And the composition of the baseball did not change until the 1911 season, when the cork center was introduced inside the rubber center. And that made for the baseball that is still in use today. But that period of, the great pitching that we talked about, and it was tremendous pitching. And Ed Walsh and Christy Mathewson and Addie Joss and Walter Johnson, and all that. They were pitching the same baseball that people had been pitching back in the 1880s. And so that's my problem with. Now, there were some other things. The introduction of the spitball, most notably. The elimination of the foul strike rule in 1901 of the National League, 1903 in the American League. Various other changes that took place that made for the pitching dominance of that period. Then you get in the 1911, 1912 seasons, you get a very significant increase in offensive output. Ty Cobb had his all-time high, 420 in 1911. Joe Jackson hit 408 and lost the batting championship. And various players had career batting years in 1911, 1912. And then, for reasons that are not at all clear, the pitchers reasserted themselves and continued to have the upper hand up until 1920. And then, again, the ball was not changed, but some other things happened that made for more power hitting. And one of the big things was that more and more hitters, Babe Ruth's making all this money, so they started trying to hit the way he did. Well, more people try to hit home runs, you're probably going to have more home runs, which is what happened beginning in the 20s. But the term dead ball era is, I think, really a misnomer. Now, I'm not on any kind of crusade to try to change people's minds, but that's just my way of looking at the period.
Well, yeah, it's also, it seems that that people sort of like to put eras, I guess, sort of in neat containers, right? And I think what you're also sort of hinting at, and obviously you're the historian, I'm more the amateur, right? This idea, frankly, the first, I don't know, I mean, you're looking at the first 2 decades of the 1900s. I mean, these were very formative years, right? I mean, still for the sport, right? And I think a lot of people sort of want to sort of conveniently categorize some of the generalities, I guess. But I mean, we've talked about it in a few past episodes. I mean, the birth of this sort of modern day World Series, right? The idea that, the idea of hitting for power versus hitting for, or manufacturing runs, and there's a whole sort of fits and starts, I guess, right? It's not sort of smooth and convenient and indicative of every year over that sort of 20-year-ish period, right? There's lots of interesting things going on, right?
Right, and of course one of the reasons why I think that we date 1900 or 1901 as the beginning of so-called modern baseball is that the American League emerged in 1901 as a competitor to the National League, and there was a 2-year war between the leagues, competition to sign players, and then peace came, and a means of governance for the 2 leagues was established, and so things settled down in terms of the basic structure of the 2 major leagues, and that lasted until the creation of the Office of Commissioner in 1920, and then the basic membership of the 2 leagues lasted until 1954, when the St. Louis Browns moved to Baltimore. So that's a long period in which you had no franchise changes. So it was a long period of stability in that regard, and all of that originated from these early years of the century and the developments that took place during those years.
Well, maybe we can use 1901 and the birth of the launch of the American League maybe as a scene setter for our segue into the Boston Braves conversation ultimately of 1914. But maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of what this team was before and then now during the American League launch, because it's my understanding that I guess they were called the Bean Eaters at that time, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. That the American League's arrival and the Boston team in that rival American League was a very substantial shock, shall we say, to this already existent National League Boston team, correct?
Well, that's correct. In the 1890s, the Boston, and the Bean Eaters, as they were sort of loosely called, and nicknaming had not yet become so formalized, but the Boston National League team won 5 pennants in the 1890s, dominated pretty much the National League. And then with the rise of the American League, the Boston American League team raided the National League team and pretty much gutted it and reduced the Boston National Leaguers to mediocrity at best and awfulness at worst, for the whole first decade and almost decade and a half of the 20th century. The Boston National Leaguers were really awful in those early years, whereas the Boston American League team, with having captured among others Cy Young, went on to win the first win the World Series with Pittsburgh in 1903, what's called the first modern World Series, and then went on to become a strong team pretty much most of the years in the early part of the century, and then in the 19-teens won pennants in 1912 and 15 and 16. And again in 1918. So the Red Sox, as they had come to be called by that time, were the team in the American League for quite a long time after the American League was established. Then you have that brief period there where the Boston Braves came on and won the pennant in the World Series in 1914, and then had strong seasons in 1915 and 16, which is what most people tend to overlook about the Braves of those years.
Well, so let's back up for a second. So what was the motivation, I guess, of these players to jump from a quite successful National League, let's call them Bean Eaters team, to this new unproven competitive league across town? Why didn't they stay? Like, why? I mean, why would you? Was it more money? What did the team put up a fight to sort of keep the players? I mean, how was this decimation sort of? How did it sort of unfold, and why? Maybe.
Well, in the 1890s, the National League owners, having got rid of the other major league, the original American Association, which operated from 1893 through 1883 through 1891. Once the American Association failed, then the National League had no competition, and the National League owners imposed a $2,400 salary cap. And it didn't make any difference how great a player you weren't going to get paid more than $2,400 a year. And the ordinary players were paid maybe $1,200, maybe $1,400 a year. Now, that was still a lot of money in that period, and you take the average wage earner was making maybe $700 a year. But nonetheless, that cap remained in force throughout the 1890s. Well, once the American League came along, the top of the cap was blown off. And it didn't take very much money to get National Leaguers to jump to the American League. Cy Young, for example, had been under the salary cap, $2,400. He signed with the Boston American Leaguers for $3,500. Well, that's $1,100. Well, that was, again, a big difference in that day. Napoleon Lajoie, who was the great star of the Philadelphia National League team in the late 1890s, jumped to the American League for, again, about $4,000 or so. But while by our standards, it didn't take very much money to get these guys to jump, it was enough. And most of the stars of the National League went over to the American League. There were a few exceptions, Honus Wagner being one of the big exceptions. Wagner stayed with Pittsburgh and throughout the remainder of his career. But the National League was very badly hurt by these defections, and no team was hurt more than the Boston National League team.
So that's it's an interesting sort of sidebar. So then, what's left, right? So what's left of this National League team? Because it seems like it was pretty dramatic, right? I mean, you're talking about a team that was essentially dominant in the latter part of the 1890s, and essentially was almost the direct opposite of that as the teens, or sorry, as the 1900s got going. Maybe you can give a sense of how I guess they were. Well, it's interesting, but maybe before we get there, it seems like even the name of the team sort of went through a few little fits and starts before we get to sort of that. So I guess I'm really curious, not only maybe in terms of the name of the team, but sort of what was left of this team on the field. It didn't seem like much.
No, it was a bunch of mostly no-name players, and they were bad year in and year out, and the ownership changed frequently, and the nickname of the team would change with the ownership. They were the Doves during one period when they were owned by the Dovey brothers. They were the Rustlers for another period when they were owned by a guy named Russell. They played in a ballpark that dated back to 1894, but it was one of the old 19th century wooden parks, and it had a seating capacity of no more than 9,000 or so. Braves, what came to be called Braves Field. And most of the time, 9,000 was plenty. Their average attendance would be around 120,000 a year. And it was pathetic. So the Boston National League team was just, it was the poor relation there in Boston. And the American League team was the big team. That began to change when new owners came along for the 1912 season. James Gaffney, who was a big shot in Tammany Hall organization, New York City, and multimillionaire in the construction business, and John Montgomery Ward, who had been a star in the National League in the 1890s. They bought the club. Ward eventually sold out his interest, but Gaffney put a lot of money into the club, and the most important thing he did was to hire George Stallings to manage the team, and he changed the name to the Braves. People who might object to that nickname now, it doesn't, it denigrates Native Americans. But in fact, the reason the Boston Braves were named the Boston Braves was because Gaffney had been, as I said, a big shot at Tammany Hall, and he was a Brave. His designation was a Brave in the Tammany Hall organization. So he just nicknamed the team the Braves. And he gave them, various icons that were attached to the uniforms and the advertising material, what have you, that would suggest the Braves. So things began to change. And eventually, after the Braves won the 1914 pennant and made enough money, then Gaffney undertook to build a new ballpark, and which beginning in the spring of 1915, it's amazing how quickly things could be built in those days. And by August of 1915, the Braves were able to move into Braves Field, which seated about 42,000 people. It was the biggest baseball facility in the world at the time, and many people claimed it to be the finest that had ever been built. And so that's where the Boston Braves were until they moved to Milwaukee for the 1953 season.
Yeah, and people in Boston, or if you're visiting Boston, from my understanding, is that there are some portions still of that original structure that are part of Boston University's Nickerson Field, which is sort of their main sport field and complex there. I've not seen it, but I'm sure for some of our listeners that could actually be a bit of a pilgrimage. No.
Well, what remains is the huge right field pavilion from Braves Field, and that's the stands on one side of the playing field there at Nickerson Field, which as I understand it, it used to be the Boston University football field, but I understand it now it's just it's a soccer field.
Yeah, we've done a number of episodes around the sport of soccer in this country, and Nickerson Field actually has quite a very interesting role to play in some of the early days of the old North American Soccer League as well. Some of the Boston-based teams sort of were there. It's not necessarily professional standard by any means in terms of size and scale and that kind of stuff, but it's another interesting footnote, which is where we wind up. Let me ask you one last question before we get into the actual on-field performance and all that. So what is it about Gaffney? I mean, any insight as to why he purchased the team, why he was intrigued, why given the Red Sox's success relatively in short order after their launch in 1901 with the American League. Like, why was he was the third of a number of different owners, right, over that short period of time to sort of deal with what is now this Braves franchise? Like, any idea as to why he even cared or thought what he maybe saw in all of this that could be, good?
Well, it's curious because, of course, he was a New York man, born and bred, and he was friends with John McGraw, and he had been a New York Giants fan. I think the reason that he got interested in the Braves is because John Montgomery Ward, talked up the proposition to him. Now, once Ward and Gaffney had bought the franchise, they did not get along at all. And so Ward sold out. But, the two of them had big plans in the beginning. Ward was, I say he's a New York man. He was native Pennsylvanian, but he'd lived in New York for a long time, practiced law in New York. And he wanted to get back into baseball one way or another. And he was looking for an opportunity to buy into a major league team. The Braves were available. And somehow he talked to Gaffney, who had the money, into going in with him. And it turned out to be a considerable success story, not so much for Ward, who left, but for Gaffney.
All right, so let's maybe get into what Gaffney and his management kind of took to relatively quickly. I mean, we're talking about, him taking ownership of the team, circa 1912, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
So that's not a long period of time to what became an amazing story 2 years later, but maybe you can give our audience a sense of perhaps what was different in this ownership go-around for this now newly rechristened Braves franchise from sort of his takeover of the team in 1912 to what leads to the seeds of what we're going to get more into is the 1914 season. But how did those first couple of seasons sort of unfold, and what was going on maybe at the time?
Well, Gaffney hired George Stallings, who had been managing in the International League, the top-level minor league, to manage the Braves. Stallings had a long career in baseball, going back to the mid-1890s, and he had managed a lot of different teams in the minor leagues. He'd even managed Detroit in the American League in its early years. So he had a lot of experience in baseball. He'd managed the New York American League team in 1909 and 1910, and had brought them up from being a miserable team, which they had been in 1908, into becoming respectable. And they got into even as high as third place before he had a falling out with the New York owner and with Hal Chase, the notorious Hal Chase, who wanted to manage the team and who undermined Stallings. So Stallings quit and drifted back to the International League. But he was a highly respected baseball man. He was a native Georgian and very much of a Southerner. And off the field, he was regarded as, a Southern gentleman. But once the baseball games began, he was no gentleman. Stallings, like Connie Mack, managed in street clothes, which meant that once the game began, he couldn't leave the dugout. That's under baseball rules. So he had, the captain of the team had to do the arguing out on the field. But Stallings would do plenty of cursing and yelling, and he was known for one of the foulest mouths in baseball, and a stern taskmaster. So he inherited a bunch of mediocre players and started to shuffle them around and get rid of them. Made some trades that nobody thought much of, but that mostly turned out well. Got some pretty good players up from the minor leagues. And then he got Johnny Evers from the Chicago Cubs. Evers had a falling out with Charles Murphy, the Cubs owner. See, earlier I mentioned, how personal things were in those days. And Evers then, he wanted to leave the Cubs. He was given his release And he signed with the Boston Braves for a big contract, multi-year contract, which was a sensational trade at the time because everybody thought Johnny Evers was the outstanding field leader among all the players in baseball and all the different teams. And indeed, Evers became a key factor in the success of the new Boston Braves. So Stallings made some shrewd moves. He got Evers. He had a couple of good pitchers that he inherited, Rudolph and Tyler. And then he brought up Bill James from the minor leagues, who won 26 games in his first year. So he somehow managed to put together a combination at work. And one of the things that he did, which was unprecedented, but what he did that was unprecedented was that he began what is later came to be called platooning. He used 3 different outfielders, depending upon whether the team was facing a left-hander or a right-hander. Right-handed hitters against left-handers, left-handed hitters against right-handers. Platooned at all 3 outfield positions. That had never been done before. And it worked. None of these outfielders, so the 6 outfielders, was an outstanding hitter. But they were all timely hitters, and so that platooning was one of the main factors why the Braves became successful.
All right, time for me to catch my breath, get a cool, tasty beverage, and remind you, while we do so, that our friends at Audible are here to remind you that you can get a free audiobook download of your choice from over 180,000 titles. If you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats and use that link, of course, to try for yourself a free audiobook on us, gratis, if you will. And you will love the idea of audiobooks. It's an awesome way to kill time and occupy and stimulate your mind, perhaps when your eyes are busy doing something else. And of course, there are plenty of interesting books to be found, especially in the world of sports and sports history. And I think our audience might enjoy a few of these, of course, including the seminal work by baseball legend Jim Bouton. It's called Ball 4. It is not only written, but it's also narrated by him. You could use your free credit for that book. And of course, as you know, Ball 4 centers around the 1969 one-year wonder that is the Seattle Pilots of Major League Baseball, but obviously the background for a whole lot of other observations about the sport of baseball. And it remains to this day perhaps one of the most celebrated writings about the sport of baseball in this country. Of course, you can also, if you're not a big baseball fan, you can go into the world of soccer with the autobiography called My Turn by Johan Cruyff, the late Johan Cruyff, perhaps one of the world's best ever soccer players. He of Dutch heritage, of course. Plenty of great legendary years at club play as well as national team play for the Dutch team, as well as, for our audience, maybe a little bit of interest, his journeys in the North American Soccer League in the late 70s and early 80s with the Washington Diplomats and the Los Angeles Aztecs. And of course, if you're into football, there's probably no better book, especially if you find yourself really interested in the sort of deep and rich history of the NFL, with the book called NFL Football, A History of America's New National Pastime. It is written by Richard Crepeau and narrated by Marlon May. That, too, is an audiobook that you could choose from over, like I said, 180,000 titles. There's got to be something in there that's going to be of interest to you. And by all means, give it a try. And we appreciate your doing so at audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you're going to get your free audiobook download. You can cancel at any time. And again, even if you cancel it, you can keep that book as long as your device exists. So again, we appreciate it. Give it a try. audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now back to our conversation. I was looking at the 1912 and 1913 seasons, right? And, from an on-field performance, right, it seems like 1912, right, new ownership didn't really make much difference because, they only went 52 and 101 finishing last in the National League. And then 1913, not tremendously better, although somewhat improved. I mean, 69 and 82, finishing fifth, right? So certainly some improvement, right? But nothing, I think, that would imagine. Well, maybe it was some movement towards the upside that maybe starting to take hold.
Well, the finishing in fifth place in 1913, I mean, that was sensational as far as Boston National League fans were concerned, because the team had been down for so long. But and then, it was definite progress. And then Stallings got Evers, got Bill James in his rookie year, and things fell into place in 1914. It didn't look that way at the beginning. The Braves started out in their usual fashion and in last place. But then, of course, they began to win after about the middle of July. And, then one going away. They finished 10 games ahead of the Giants. It's one of the great stories in baseball history. It's just not only a team that had been down for so long that came on to win a podium, but that the way they did it, they just blew the rest of the league away in the second half of the season.
So, okay, so maybe some insight as to sort of why. I mean, you mentioned sort of July or so. I mean, according to my records, they kind of started off, as you said, somewhat right on cue with their sort of previous years of performance with a 4-18 start, and almost frankly seemed destined for, if not a last place finish, certainly pretty darn close to it. But I'm just curious as to what any catalysts, any things along the way, say in July or anything during the season that kind of turned things, or is it just simply a bolt of luck and lightning, so to speak? Well,
Stallings in the second half of the season settled on these three starting pitchers, and they carried almost all the load: Rudolph and James and Tyler. And they just, they were all three outstanding. Also, Stallings got from Brooklyn a third baseman named Red Smith, who was considered one of the best third basemen in the National League. Again, he had personal difficulties with Charles Ebbets, the Brooklyn owner, and Ebbets got rid of him. Well, he turned out to be a key factor in the Braves' success in the rest of the season. Unfortunately, he broke his leg in the last game of the season and couldn't play in the World Series. But he was a good ball player. He's forgotten today, but in his time he was a solid third baseman and solid hitter. So, and then of course, Rabbit Moranville was in his third year, his second full year with the Braves. Rabbit Moranville, one of the most colorful figures, I guess, ever in baseball history. A little guy, 5'5" or 5'6", maybe 5'6" on his toes, who was a slick shortstop, and he really solidified the infield with Evers and Smith at third, and then a fellow named Butch. What's his name? I can't think of his last name, right? Just offhand. Big guy and good, solid first baseman and solid hitter. So Stallings had really an excellent infield by the time, I would say by July. He had an excellent infield, and then he had these three really great pitchers that year. And the Braves also were they were good afield. They didn't make very many errors, and for that period. So all of that is pretty much the story. The platooning in the outfield, the solid infield, and three outstanding pitchers.
So it seems like almost like July 4th of that year was almost like a sort of if you could draw a line sort of the before and after of the 1914 Boston Braves. It was sort of that date for some reason, because again, according to my data here, I mean, it shows that the team kind of sat at in the bottom of the table. I think they were 26-40. They had just lost a doubleheader to the Brooklyn Dodgers that day, July 4th. And I guess they had a day off that next day. And then literally from July 6th through, I guess it was the early part of September, the Braves put together a 41 game and 12 loss streak, 41 and 12 in that period of time, right? Having started at 26 and 40, and really became in contention until the weekend of the 7th and 8th of September, where they actually beat the New York Giants 2 out of 3, who were the leading club at the time, and moved into first place. I mean, and then come September, October, they were essentially on fire, and it's an amazing turnaround. And you just wonder. This now gets into sort of issues around baseball, right? So you get hot, you get lucky, you get team starts gelling, starts playing well. You wonder sort of what other things. I mean, superstition. I mean, what sort of other sort of, I guess, intangibles you wonder sort of came into play to make them sort of coalesce into something that became somewhat of a confident and winning a proposition on the field after having years, and even the last 2 years of ownership, not being the case.
Well, of course, the Braves of 1914 were an almost totally different team from the Braves of 1913, with a few exceptions. So it was a made-over team. The other factor is that the Giants, who of course were perennial power in the National League, managed by McGraw. The Giants had an aging team in 1914, and a lot of these guys were on the downside of their careers, and in fact, the Giants finished dead last the next year. So that was, the way they faded in the last part of the season while the Braves just ran away was sort of a harbinger of how bad the Giants were going to be in the next year. And then McGraw had to rebuild that team, which he did, and then came back and won the pennant in 1917. But the Giants were, everybody thought that they were the strongest team in the National League in 1914, but it turns out they were not at all. They were not nearly as good as everybody thought they were.
So before we move on to the rest of the season, you mentioned this this character, Rabbit Moranville, right? So Walter James Vincent Rabbit, quote unquote, Moranville. Maybe a little bit of insight into him. He seems like quite the character. I think he was kind of known as sort of a clown kind of character, right? Of sort of a jokester, if you will. He
was that, but he also was a good, solid ball player and had a long career in the National League, and of course was later voted into the Hall of Fame by the Veterans Committee, the old Veterans Committee. Now, I personally don't think that Rabbit Moranville has any business in the Hall of Fame any more than a number of other people who are in the Hall of Fame do. But he was a very popular figure. One of the things he did was on pop flies to shortstop area, he would make this basket catch. Instead of reaching up for the ball, he would catch it at his belt, and that was very popular with the fans. They love to see Rabbit do the basket catch all around the National League. So he was just a character, but a pretty good ball player, a good shortstop, and hung around for a long time. He managed the Pirates during one period of the 1920s, and he was a good time manager. He enjoyed having a good time with his players more than he was interested in doing serious managing. But he's one of those guys that we don't have players like that anymore. They're real characters. He was just that. He was, sort of later on, Dizzy Dean and Mark Fidrick and some of the other characters who've come along. But they don't come along anymore. Everybody is straight arrow and concentrating on his game. And they're, in interviews, everybody says the same thing now. And so that's part of Moranville's appeal. He was just a guy that you would pay your money to see play, because he was, he gave you something to watch apart from just, the ordinary baseball play.
Well, I guess there were fans showing up for the team as well, besides just him, right? Because it's clear the team got really hot. And if I'm not mistaken, and I think this is the case, right? They are still the 1914 Boston Braves. Were the only team, or have been the only team to ever win a pennant after having been in last place on the 4th of July during a baseball season. That's a pretty, unbelievably dramatic. Yeah. Is that true?
That's correct. Yeah.
I mean, that's amazing. Right? It's an amazing thing, and it still holds up today. Yet, going into having won the pennant, right, going into the World Series, this relatively fledgling thing called the World Series, they were huge underdogs still against the Philadelphia A's. No.
That's true, and the Philadelphia A's were one of the great teams of that period. They had won they won the American League pennant in the World Series in 1910. They'd beaten the Giants in the World Series of 1911 and 12, and it was basically the same intact team that had won those pennants. And Connie Mack was regarded as the greatest manager in the American League. John McGraw in the National League. The idea was that the Braves would have no chance against this great team. Well, the Athletics were having their troubles. We haven't talked about the Federal League, but the Federal League had come on the scene as a purported major league, claiming to be a third major league for the 1914 season, and had gone after American and National League players in the same way that the American League had gone after National League players in 1901 and 2. And the National League was hurt more by these defections than the American League. But throughout the season, as Mack later revealed, the Federal League agents were hanging around the Athletics and offering them big money to jump, and the morale on the team was not very good going into the World Series. In those days, sports writers, I think, tended to attribute more to spirit, morality. No, it's not morality, but morale, and also to being overconfident. Oftentimes when teams lost, they were heavily favored. Say, well, they were just overconfident. And sports writers tended to view things in that way in those days, and consequently, the loss of the Athletics was often a lot of the writers said, well, they were just overconfident. They didn't play up to what they could. But the Athletics won the World Series. They were not really a unified team, and some of them were already looking to the Federal League for next year and the bigger money, and so all those factors came into play as well. And Mack was particularly disappointed with his right-handed ace, Chief Bender, in that series. And when he took Bender out of the first game of the series in Philadelphia, that was the first time that Mack had ever removed a pitcher from a World Series game. And he was quite unhappy with Bender and with various of his other players as well. Well, after the season, he gave Bender, as well as Eddie Plank, his ace left-hander, their releases, and they signed with the Federal League. So there are a whole lot of factors coming into play here. It's sort of an undercurrent of things. It probably did affect the outcome.
Yeah, our episode 63, we had a good conversation with Dan Levitt about sort of the Federal League and stuff. But this is an interesting sort of byproduct, right? or connection, right? Because you're talking about players who for whatever reasons aren't necessarily finding themselves to be either adequately paid or their services being sort of appreciated and all these kinds of things, and obviously a very long-lasting set of issues that even dot the landscape even in today's big money professional leagues of today. But the idea, the player welfare and being able to more freely market one's services, you can understand some of the dynamics there at play when in the times earlier where there were the reserve clause was very much in place and owners were much more solidly in control of sort of all kinds of movements both on and off the field.
Yeah, this is true. And Connie Mack's attitude about salaries, and he felt that he had to keep the salaries low. But he also believed that, well, the Athletics had been in the World Series so many times, and they had picked up World Series checks. And after all, they had made a lot of money by winning and getting into the World Series. Well, they had, Bender and Plank, for example, had been with Mack from the beginning in 1901. And they had been in the World Series in 1904, and again in 10 and 11 and 12, in 10 and 11 and 13. So they had picked up those World Series checks, and Mack said, well, what are they unhappy about? They made all this money because we've won. But it's true that for one of the great teams of that time, the Athletics were not well paid. And Connie Mack was always very parsimonious with his players, even when he had, his second great team in 1929-31.
Yeah, so I mean, there are some that and maybe you're hinting at this, right? That perhaps those penny pinching ways, perhaps, were a little bit of a disincentive, perhaps, not only sort of arrogance or complacency, but perhaps it was. I don't know, maybe the players weren't sort of giving their all sort of as a bit of a message, perhaps? Maybe that's what you're hinting at.
Well, that's entirely possible. I don't think that was true of Eddie Collins, for example, the future Hall of Famer second baseman, one of the great players ever. I think he always put out everything he had, but he had a poor World Series. And Johnny Evers, who was much less of a player than Collins, nonetheless, outplayed Collins in the World Series. So I don't know. It's just a case of a hot team catching a team that was down, and it took 4 games. That's all it took.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it was the first sweep in a World Series up to that point. And you say hot. One thing we sort of we kind of overlooked is the fact that the Braves. They won the pennant, the National League pennant, by 10.5 games, right? Remember, this is a team that was solidly in last place come July 4th and won going away and then some. So let me ask you, so a couple other little interesting asterisks here. So during this World Series, right? So given the hotness of this team, and I suspect some increased, finally, love from some of the Boston baseball fans. An interesting little sidebar to this is that the Braves, did not play their home games during the World Series at their home ballpark. Maybe you get into that, why that was the case.
Well, the Braves field had been enlarged a bit after Gaffney became the owner, but it was still one of the smallest ballparks in the major leagues, and Fenway Park had opened at the beginning of 1912 season, and seated about 25,000 or so, and so it was much bigger than Braves Field, and so Gaffney got an agreement with the Red Sox owner Joseph Lannon to be able to use Fenway Park for the World Series. It turned about in 1915. When the Red Sox won the American League pennant, by this time Braves Field had been built with its huge capacity for that day, and the Red Sox then played their home games of the 1915 World Series against the Phillies in Braves Field.
Interesting. So you're saying that the South End grounds where the Braves were playing in 1913, 1914 weren't big enough, or the accommodations and the size just wasn't large enough to sort of house, if you will, sort of the growing interest instead of a World Series. So they played at Fenway Park, the home of the Red Sox. And then you're saying the next year, while Braves Field was being, I guess, constructed, when the Red Sox actually won their pennant, they decided to actually come to Braves Field in 1915, brand new ballpark, and play their World Series games there?
That's correct.
Interesting. Now, why would the Red Sox, given a relatively new and successful ballpark, especially one that hosted the World Series, albeit from a renter, if you will, the season before, why would they Was it returning the favor? I'm just curious as to why they would even do that, go to the brand new Braves field when they had a relatively new ballpark of their own and quite successful at that.
I don't know how much money may have changed hands. I'm sure that it was not just a gift in either instance. But I have never run across any publicity on how much the Braves may have paid the Red Sox in 1914 or how much the Red Sox may have paid the Braves in 1915. But anyhow, that's the way it was done. And so you have those two quirky things about the two Boston champions in those 2 years.
Yeah, it's especially interesting given the sort of somewhat, acrimonious or contentious rivalry, if you will, that kind of started the relationship between those two teams years earlier. It's just very interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So here's one other sort of interesting little sidebar, and maybe you can give some color to this too. So, obviously in 1919, when the sort of the big time Black Sox scandal sort of hit baseball pretty hard, it seems to me that based on my crack research, that around this time, the 1914 or so World Series, gambling was very much part of the mixture, albeit not legally sanctioned. Was there any sort of influence of gambling in perhaps the Philadelphia A's subpar performance? Seems like there's some whiffs of controversy that maybe the influence of some untoward gambling activities might have had some stake in it too, or is that not is that not true based on your data and your research?
No, I don't. I never ran across any indication of that. Obviously, it was such a spectacular and unexpected development, the Braves sweep, that there are going to be those who suspected that gamblers may have got to some of the Athletics, but the rumors really didn't even surface. I mean, they weren't even given much prominence. So no, I don't think that gamblers had any effect on things. It was. I think things were played strictly on the up and up. But I think the problem was that the Braves, as I said, were so hot, and that several of the Athletics players were just not really up for the series. As I said, the morale on the team is not very good. And it's interesting also that attendance for the Athletics at Shibe Park that season had fallen, even though the Athletics were winning another pennant. It appears that a lot of their fans had just got tired of their winning so many times. So it was not a good attendance year for a team that won the American League pennant.
All right, well, let's talk about sort of the aftermath, right? So the Braves winning sort of against all odds the 1914 World Series, their first, I guess, ever, certainly as the Boston Braves. But it was not the beginning of a dynasty by any stretch of the imagination, nor, by the way, was it necessarily a kick in the butt for the Philadelphia A's either, who sort of went on their own sort of downslope. Some of it engineered, some of it maybe not so. Maybe a few years of aftermath of sort of what became of, I guess, both the A's, but certainly the Braves after that amazing a bolt of lightning season in 1914.
Well, after the 1914 season, Connie Mack simply tore his team apart, and they had an awful team in 1915, and they never were respectable again until the mid-1920s. As far as the Braves are concerned, they were a strong competitive team in 1915 and 16. Finished second in 1915 to the Phillies. They finished third in 1916, but actually had a better record than they had in finishing second the previous year. So they were a competitive team. They continued to draw well there at Braves Field, and it looked as if they would continue to be a good, respectable team in the National League for some time to come. That didn't happen. Evers pretty much played out. Bill James ruined his arm and various players who had career years in that one year in 1914 were never that good again. And some of them, Butch Smith, their first baseman, simply retired and went back to running his butcher business in Baltimore. So the Braves, after the 1916 season, faded, and they were not much good again they had a couple of respectable years in the 1930s. But it wasn't until after World War II that the Boston Braves were, again, a good team in the National League, and, of course, won the National League pennant in 1948 and lost to Cleveland in the World Series.
But it took them until 1948 to even get close to, or actually winning, another pennant again. I mean, that's an amazing dry spell after having won it all in 1914 to go just that length of period of time to not even another pennant, let alone a World Series appearance.
Yeah, although you wonder how long it's going to take the Kansas City Royals to come back again after they went for a long time without a pennant, and then won a couple, and then they're bad again. So I don't know. The Braves, in 1948, with Warren Spahn and Johnny Sane, Bob Elliott, Alvin Dark, and Eddie Stanky at second base, they were a very good team, and it looked as if they had bright years ahead. They set an attendance record for the first time. They pulled over 1 million people into Braves Field, 1,600,000 at that. And but then 4 years later, 4.5 years later, by the spring of 1953, they were moving to Milwaukee, and it was a remarkable collapse of a franchise in 49 and 50 and 51 and 52. It really was. And what happened to the Boston Braves? And the ownership remained the same. Yeah, the ownership, Lou Perini continued to be the principal owner of the Braves, and he was the one who moved the Braves to Milwaukee. So it wasn't a matter of ownership change. I don't know. That is an interesting story in itself.
Well, there's no doubt the history of the Braves is a very interesting one, and I think and again, I'm not an historian, I just play one on television, right? Is if you look back, it is going back into even the National Association days in its sort of more informative years, right? Is the longest continuously running franchise in baseball history, and to understand. If you're an Atlanta Braves fan or even a former Milwaukee Braves fan, we've talked about that in a previous episode as well, to know some of these little asterisks in the Boston version of this club's heritage is really interesting. And again, this 1914, I mean, very few people, if any, are still around from that time, of course. But to know sort of the 1 year wonder, I guess, of this franchise that, by all accounts, didn't do a whole heck of a lot much more, in the modern era of baseball than this one sort of scintillating and amazing second half of a season in 1914 to win it all back in the day. And I appreciate, Charlie, your sort of your recollections of your history and your pursuit of this. Is there anything from this story, if anything, that either continues to resonate or perhaps changed people's mindsets? I mean, is there any lasting legacy aside from the fact that it was an interesting year, both for the franchise and baseball, or is there something more substantial to this run of the Boston Braves in 1914?
Well, I don't know if there's anything more substantial. I would say that as a baseball historian and as a SABR member, SABR dedicated to the study of baseball history, it would be good if the contemporary Atlanta Braves fans would take some interest in the long history of the franchise, going back to the 19th century, and especially would develop some awareness of the 1914 and 15 and 16 Boston Braves. I doubt if there are a lot of Atlanta Braves fans around today who even know anything about the Milwaukee Braves, which is, that's kind of sad. Most people, they think of history in terms of, well, there's now and then there's back then. They don't think of the seamless connection between then and now, and how then affects now, and how we ought to understand that. But that's all that I would suggest. That the people who follow the Atlanta Braves today maybe should be made more aware that long before the Atlanta Braves, there were the Milwaukee Braves, and long before that, there were the Boston Braves.
All right, you cannot say that you did not learn something this week, and it is partially our goal in life to educate and to disseminate information that makes you look smarter. As the listener, whenever you're roped into conversations about sports, and if you find yourself at a game in Atlanta watching the Braves in suburban Atlanta, or perhaps you find yourself in the great state of Wisconsin and you're in Milwaukee watching a Brewers game, well, you can sort of tell the young whippersnappers there used to be a team prior to the Brewers there known as the Braves. And hell, maybe you're even in Boston and you really want to go way back and show your amazing comprehension of the history of the sport of baseball and just the fabric of history of the city of Boston proper by regaling in some of the 1914 memories and stories about the miracle then Boston Braves of the National League back then. And we thank Charlie Alexander tremendously for being part of it. The book, again, is called The Miracle Braves, 1914 and 1916. It is published by our friends at McFarland. And while you're there searching out that book, and of course you can go to goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up our little episode here, number 72, and you will find a convenient link to that book, as well as some links to some of Charlie's other works. And we've alluded to them before, but some seminal histories about folks like Rogers Hornsby and Ty Cobb, and other sort of stories and teams around that era, 1910s, 1920s, even earlier and later, with Charlie Alexander, who is quite a prolific baseball historian and writer. You will do well by reading at least a few of those books, and we appreciate you clicking on that link on our website to do so, giving us a little love in the process. We also, speaking of love, want to share our love in a platonic way, of course, with our friends at Podfly Productions, in particular, the good Dr. Jerry Payne, who puts all our pieces together, and each and every week makes us sound somewhat intelligible, and we appreciate him and Podfly Productions' capabilities. And of course, if you're interested in doing your own podcast thing, by all means, check them out at podfly.net. You could do worse than to work with the folks at Podfly to help you get up and running. Before we run, we want to remind you that, again, goodseatsstillavailable.com, that's the place to go to find all of our old episodes. Please, 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 I beg of you, wherever you listen, by all means, please. It could be on social media, but certainly on places like Apple Podcasts or iTunes or any of the other places you can do so. Please rate and review us, especially if you think highly or favorably of us. It's probably the best thing that you can do without shelling out any bucks to help the show, to get us discovered. Other people like you who might enjoy this kind of programming, we appreciate that. It helps us get found and surfaced and recommended. By all means, rate and review us highly, of course, if you're inclined, early and often, as we say, and we appreciate that. Also on social media, we love when you follow us and tweet and or message back to us. You can always do that too at Twitter, where you'll find us at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us on Facebook as well. There's a little page devoted to us as well. And if you want to send us an email, by all means, send us an email too. You can send that to hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Again, if you forget any of that stuff, just go to the website. You'll find all our good stuff there. Lots more good stuff to come in the coming weeks. We appreciate your suggestions, and we thank you for listening, as always. And until next week, we bid you a fond adieu. Thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.